Hey everybody, Objectively Dan here, and I got a question for you guys, especially for you Christians out there. What do you think hell is exactly? Is it a place of eternal torment? Is it another death? Is it just a separation from God? I got a couple different verses here. One of them is from Matthew 25:41 that says, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" And I got another verse from Revelations that basically says, if your name is not found in the book of life, you will be thrown into a lake of fire. And I don't know if that's literal or not. So I got to know, what do you think of these verses? Is this actually a real place that's being described, or is this just some sort of metaphor? And honestly, if this is real, is this the act of a loving God or a moral being? I need somebody to clear this up. So please call into the show because it's starting right now. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Truth Wanted. I am your host, Objectively Dan. This is the live call-in show that happens every single week, Fridays at 7 p.m. Central Time. We talk to you about what people believe and why. And every single week, we always have a special guest. This week is no different. We have Ilana DeBare joining us today. Ilana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. Ilana is an author, a journalist, a former journalist, a school starter, a whole bunch of stuff. Very interesting person. Happy to talk to her today about one of her books and also just her life and her interest in hell, because you have a book about someone going to the Christian hell, which is interesting because you are not a Christian. So we will talk about that in just a second here. But just to get some stuff out of the way, Truth Wanted is a product of the atheist community of Austin, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of atheism, critical thinking, secular humanism, and the separation of religion and government. And if you want to talk to us, you can do it right now. We are live, and there is a number you can call. It is 512-991-9242, or you can call through your computer at tiny.cc/calltw. So get in there. We would love to talk to you guys in just a bit. But for now, I'm going to be talking to Ilana. Ilana, you have a book that's called Shaken Loose, and it's the story about a young woman who basically finds herself in hell. This is interesting because you are a Jewish person. You also identify as an atheist. And how does somebody like yourself actually decide to write a book like this?
Well, first of all, I just want to be totally clear for the audience. This is fiction. It's a novel.
Yes,
this is not one of these books where I claim to have died and gone to heaven or hell and are coming back and writing about it. This is made up. And let me just give a real nutshell summary of what the book is about, because then that will help me explain why I wrote it. But as you said, the main character is a young secular woman from the Bay Area. She dies, goes to hell, and finds herself in a place she never imagined could possibly exist. And it's classic Christian fundamentalist hell. There's fire, there's brimstones, there's Satan. Everything she knew about the world is wrong. And it's also a terribly unjust place. It's filled with some people who are truly evil, and then many millions of people who simply were not baptized Christians. So there's people there who lived before. There's one character who's a West African from before colonialism. He never heard of Christianity or Jesus or hell. There's characters from Asia. There's characters from the Hun tribes on the edge of the Roman Empire. There's people who are perfectly good, decent, flawed, like the rest of us who were there, but they just weren't Christian. And the place is starting to fall apart. It's unraveling. So that's the concept. It's kind of a dystopic hell. It's a very unjust place, and all these characters are trying to get out. Why did I write this?
Yeah.
I am Jewish. I am an atheist. I didn't grow up with any conception of hell at all. But I'd written several novels before this one, and the previous ones had been kind of narrow about, say, people in a couple in a relationship. I wanted to do something broader. I started thinking about historical novels, which I love. but I got daunted by how much research it would take to write about a different era. And then I thought, fantasy, you could just make everything up.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, just
except what I didn't realize when I went into it was first of all, I had to research the whole concept and history of hell, which is really interesting. We could talk about that a little later.
Yeah.
But also I have all these people there from these different societies, all of whom die with their own beliefs, their own assumptions, their own expectations of what would happen in the afterlife. And so instead of researching one historical era, I ended up spending time researching pre-colonial Igbo beliefs, researching what Huns thought about the afterlife, researching what a young communist in Shanghai in the 1920s would have thought about the afterlife and what they missed at home and what their lives were like and their values. So it ended up being a lot of research. And maybe historical fiction was not easier.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it.
No, but the real reason I picked this topic was I was playing with I always start a book with a what if idea. And for me, this one was, what if everything I knew about the world was wrong? And being who I am, which is a secular person, a science-based person, a rational person, it kind of turned into, what if the fundamentalists are right and everything I believe is wrong? Evolution is wrong. Science is wrong, and hell exists.
Yeah,
sure. And I'm going there.
Yeah.
And so in a way, the central character was a surrogate for myself, although she's a very different person and has her own issues and her own story. But that was the original question that I entered it with, was thinking about a world that would be so much the opposite of everything that I had assumed.
Yeah. So you're telling me in all of your research of hell, you didn't find it was a pleasant place. That's interesting. I think maybe you'd find some solace in there. No, I'm just kidding. It doesn't sound like it would be a pleasant thing to kind of look at the history of hell. Personally speaking, as a Christian, formerly Christian, not a Christian anymore, but when I grew up as a Christian, there was even a debate even amongst the people that I went to church with about, what hell even is. There's kind of these different concepts. One very popular concept, which I think a lot of my family took in, was it's just a separation from God. This idea that look, God's kind of in his own domain. And then there's this other domain where I guess anything goes. It's honestly kind of vague, but it's not necessarily torture. And then there's this other idea where it's like, oh no, it is torture. It is a place where you will suffer and you do that for eternity. And then there's another kind of idea where it's like, oh, it's a lake of fire where you just kind of burn and then you cease to exist. So there's never been a clear consensus from my understanding in Christian history about what exactly hell is. Is that true for your understanding?
That's very true. It's there have been very different conceptions as time has gone on, and then in different versions of Christianity. Like the Catholic version includes a limbo, it includes purgatory. Protestant versions do not have either of those things. So there's very different views. And I think, if you talk to modern liberal Christians, it's probably more like what you were raised with, the idea of hell is separation from God, that the idea of being with God is so wonderful that being deprived of that is more painful and more of a punishment or more of a deprivation than being burning in a lake of fire. But when you go back, say go back 100 years to 2,000 years back, there is a lot of burning in fire. That is a common through line. And burning in fire, torture, devils, Satan.
Yeah, again, not super fun. And this is a kind of an interesting idea for me because I have to wonder about the people who know that I was a Christian, I'm not anymore. What they think, their friend is just going to burn forever, and I guess that's just going to be okay. There is a weird sort of psychological separation you kind of have to have with that idea that I've always personally found fascinating. But back to yourself, because you do identify as Jewish. And I know you grew up Jewish, and the Jewish understanding of hell really is that it's not really a thing. From my understanding of the Jewish understanding of hell, right? There's concept of Sheol, and which is kind of a different thing from hell. It's kind of almost a sort of limbo within itself. But again, there's never been kind of a consistent idea of the afterlife, even in Judaism, from my understanding. Was that kind of your understanding growing up in the faith?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there is not a single definition or understanding of it. What you can say is that it places a lot less of an emphasis on a punishing afterlife than Christianity does. It's really almost an afterthought. And in the books of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there's no mention of a punishing afterlife. What they do have is what you call, you talked about Sheol, which is just this kind of shadowy place. It's almost like the Greek underworld where nothing bad happened, nothing good happened. Or they talk about, when they talk about people like Jacob and Abraham dying, they say they went to rest with their ancestors, or their bones were gathered to their ancestors. So it's kind of this vague, shadowy place, maybe kind of underground where you're buried, but nothing bad happens. And the place where an idea of hell starts to emerge is in the much, much later books of the Old Testament, like the book of Daniel. And then you get into the early, the early Christian parts of the Bible, where there is much more of an emphasis on punishment, part of which, people who are looking at the Bible historically or as a literary document look at it as that's a period when the Jewish people were suffering a lot. They'd been exiled from Jerusalem. They were in exile in Babylonia. Then they came back. Then the temple was destroyed again. They were at the mercy of these really large empires, the Babylonians, the Syrians, the Greeks, the Romans. And when you're really suffering like that, you're looking for some kind of justice. You're looking for somebody to come to your aid against these big powers that are destroying you. And so, you look to your theology. Maybe you invent a theology where all these bad people who are doing terrible things to you, they will suffer later. I'm suffering now, but they'll suffer later.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And as you talked about this already, but even in early Christian development, there's still mixed ideas about it. I know in some parts of the New Testament, they even literally use the word Hades. They can give it as a real place. So that was something that always confused me, of course, growing up and, already talking about this, of what hell even is. But you write this book and you include it as a big part of your story. And I'm wondering what drove you to do this, because as you mentioned before, like, you are a Jewish person. So was it just the fascination behind the history of it? Was it just the the history of the idea, or was it something else?
So it's a bunch of different things. One is, I think, whatever your belief or lack of belief is, living in America, hell is part of the culture. It's, even if you're not religious, people talk about it all the time. It's, when hell freezes over. This person was hell on wheels. Oh, I didn't really want to eat that big piece of chocolate cake, but the devil made me do it. Yeah, so it's part of the culture that we swim in, even if we don't really believe in it. So I think we all are affected by it in some way, even if it's not a major way. It's also, it has a long tradition in English literature, American literature. I was an English major in college. I'm a writer. Two of the things that I drew on in my vision, the vision that I had in my book, were in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. There's a sermon that he gives that the main character, who's kind of a stand-in for Joyce as a young man. He's a young Catholic boy in Dublin, and he's in a Catholic school, and the priests give this horrific sermon that goes on for pages and pages, telling these young children how terrible hell is and how they're going to suffer if they do, these minor things wrong. And that is just, it's very dramatic and very horrific. Another, crossing the Atlantic pond, there, in the 1700s, there was a revival movement, and one of the great preachers of that movement was Jonathan Edwards. And one of his most famous sermons is called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God."
Yes.
And he lays it on thick too. He talks about, you are destined for hellfire unless you are one of the elect. You are like a spider being dangled over the flames every minute, and it's only God's mercy that will keep you from falling to. So as someone who read books, liked literature, lived in American culture. It was all something that I was aware of, I was interested in. It was, but for me, it was never, I did not grow up with an idea of hell. I did not grow up with an idea of an afterlife. And so for me, it was kind of a fantasy or even an intellectual interest. It wasn't something, I think if I'd grown up in a family where I was told that this was going to happen to me if I sinned, I would have been so traumatized I would not have wanted to write a novel about it. I would have just like gone far away. But because I was that distant from it, I was able to be interested in it as opposed to traumatized by it. But one thing I realized when I worked on this for about 10 years, from the time I started thinking about it to the time I actually, it actually came out and was published. And about halfway through, I realized that there are ways in which it is a very Jewish book, even though the main character isn't Jewish. There's barely any mention of anything Jewish in it, but it's a Holocaust book that never mentions the Holocaust, in that it raises the question of how can a supposedly just God tolerate or even create a universe with so much injustice in it? And that's a question that Jews and other theologians have been asking since the Holocaust. And it's also a question that if you believe in this kind of hell, the kind of hell that I drew in the book, where people who are perfectly good, moral people, but just don't happen to be Christian, are punished for eternity, what kind of God would do that? And is that a just God?
Yeah. Very powerful observation there, I think, because speaking of my own story, right? You mentioned, I don't think I would write this if I was a Christian. When I was a Christian and when I was leaving the faith, and I've told this story on there before, but the first time I said out loud that I was an atheist to someone, that week I had multiple nightmares about dying and going to hell. And I look back at that as one of the worst times in my life. For one, because I'm like deconstructing this idea that I've had for a really long time about who I was and my identity and my purpose in the universe. But another, because I was actually afraid of the consequences of what was going to happen now that I didn't believe, because, the cat was out of the bag at that point. I couldn't just say, oh, I'm just going to start believing now, right? It's not really how that works, right? You either believe something or you don't, in my opinion, right? And so like that was a really powerful thing for me, because it made me realize how many people are still in this thing because of that belief, because of the fear, the threat of it. It's a non-zero number, right? It can't be all of them, but it can't be none of them. So I think that's a powerful indicator of like what a belief like that can do to someone. I don't know if it works for moral compliance, but it certainly can scare the crap out of people. At least it scares the crap out of me when I think about it. But real quick, we're going to take a brief break from our conversation and talk about the comments that you guys leave. We're going to talk about the We Want the Truth segment here, folks. Every single week, we are asking you guys a prompt that we want your answers to. And last week, we asked you guys a question: what's Jesus's best excuse for not showing up? And we have our top 3 answers for you right here. We're going to put them on screen. Number 3 comes from the MS Zucks, who says Jesus didn't show up because he was hammered, which that's such a dad joke. I don't know, but I really enjoyed that one. That was a good one. Thank you for that contribution. Number 2 comes from L. Gisson, who says Jesus didn't show up yet because he is too embarrassed by the behavior of people who call themselves his followers. And yeah, I gotta say, that's a good one. That's a good one. Pretty true in my experience. At least would explain. I just didn't say it's pretty true because I don't know if he's coming back, but I would see how that could be a plausible reason there. But number 1 comes from Chuck Gatos, who says Jesus's excuse for not showing up: now that he has a crown of thorns, they can't find a volunteer to give birth to him again, which is, I don't know. You guys are crazy. You guys submit some really crazy comments, but thank you guys for your submissions this week. This next week, we have a prompt for you, and it's this: complete the sentence. It's a bad idea to blank at a formal event. So leave your best answer below, and we'll read our top 3 favorite comments from last week or this next week. Man, ooh, I'm out of it today. But thank you guys so much for your contributions there. I'll ask you, Ilana, it's a bad idea to blink at a formal event. Any ideas for that prompt?
I think it's a really bad idea to blanket a formal event, which I often
true.
do. I'm in a crowd and somebody will say, "Here, this is Charles," and within 3 seconds, I've forgotten Charles's name.
Yeah,
because of pressure of meeting lots of people. So I think just like blanking and having a moment of amnesia is a really bad thing to do.
That's so true. I've been blanking tonight. I read my intro out of order. Longtime viewers will probably have noticed because I'm just all over the place tonight. But that's all right. We all have our bad nights, and I'm happy to have a great conversation here with Ilana. But a reminder as well: this is a call-in show. I see we got a couple calls in, but we still have some open lines. So if you want to come talk to us, please. The number is down below in that chevron, and we'll get you guys in just a sec. But for now, I'm going to continue my conversation with you, Ilana. So many awesome directions we can go with this conversation, but something I told you I want to ask you before the show started that I want to talk to you about now, because I've met several Jewish atheists in my life. I've never met a Christian atheist. I assume they exist. I personally haven't. What do you think it is about the Jewish community that seems to be more comfortable with that atheist label than maybe like the Christian community does? I've heard different ideas from folks, but I'd love to get your take on what that label means for you.
Well, Judaism is different from Christianity in that it's not just a religion; it's also a culture.
Yeah.
And some would argue it's a nationality, but whether or not you see it as a nationality, it's certainly a culture. And so, if you look at it as any other kind of culture, Norwegian culture. You can be a Norwegian believer or a Norwegian atheist. You can be a Jewish believer or a Jewish atheist, but it does get bollocksed up because it is both a religion and a culture. For me, the way I approach it is I don't believe in God. I certainly don't believe in a God with a long white beard and all that stuff. But the ethics of Judaism, I strongly appreciate. I appreciate how the history of Judaism has been filled with arguments with God. And even if you don't think God exists, I appreciate the concept of a people arguing with their maker and arguing with this force that controls the universe. I mean, going back to Abraham arguing with God over whether it's just to kill the entire city of Sodom because there were some bad guys, and then bargaining him down. Okay, if you can find a certain number of good men, I won't destroy the city. And then Abraham says, "Well, how about if we find a few less? Instead of 40, what if we just find 20 good guys?" And God says, "Okay." And then what if we find 10 good guys? And so I love the concept from a sort of mythic, cultural, ethical point of view of a religion that does that. I think it is a very human-centered, life-centered religion. And the parts of it that are talking about God in when I attend services, basically I take out the word God and I put in universe, life. So if we're talking about thanking God for something or other, I'm thanking life. I'm thanking the universe. And feeling gratitude for being here, for being part of a community, for being alive, all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of where I come from with it. But I think for many people, for many Jews, there's an appreciation of history, family, what their ancestors went through, the values behind the holidays. You can look at a holiday like Passover as a holiday about freedom, escaping slavery, working for a more just world. And you can appreciate it very much that way and look at the miracles as folk legends or metaphors or things like that.
Yeah, that's one thing I've personally have been jealous of in the Jewish tradition that I didn't have growing up. Because like there is an idea of Christian fundamentalism, which we've talked oftentimes on this show about how actually modern the idea of Christian fundamentalism kind of is in many respects. You know, it's not as ancient or as old as many Christians tend to, you know, think, depending on the particular kinds of beliefs. But Judaism, from my, you know, cursory understanding of it, it has never been about one fundamental text that has been the giver of everything. Much Jewish literature is just arguing. Like, it's just a lot of people who are saying, I'm an expert on this subject, and here's another expert on this subject, and here's my commentary on it, and here's other commentaries on it. A lot of Christians think, oh yeah, the Old Testament, yeah, that's the Jewish literature. No, it goes the Talmud, the Zohar. There's tons and tons of texts, rabbinic literature that really does debate about God, which I think is really fascinating. You don't really see that in the New Testament so much, or in other Christian texts that are similar. There's a perception of authoritativeness that comes in a lot of the Christian tradition, whereas the Jewish tradition, and from my understanding, because obviously it's, you know, it's varied, but for many Jewish traditions, it's a much more open conversation, which I kind of like. I wish my Christianity was more of an open conversation. I'm sure there's folks that, you know, certainly grew up that way, but for many of us who grew up in a more fundamentalist Christian home, that wasn't really the case. It was just kind of like, this is the way it is, and deal with it, you know? So interesting dichotomy there for sure. But in talking about your book and in talking about hell, you spent 10 years, what you told me, in researching this. That's a long time to research a book about hell. Did it ever like depress you? Like, did it ever kind of, you know, make you feel differently about humanity after looking at a, you know, research like that?
So 10 years wasn't just the research. It was research. It was writing. It was rewriting. It was rewriting, finding a publisher, getting the book through the publishing. But yes, it was a long time, and it was not at all depressing. And at times it was actually, I would retreat into this world because our real world, think about that, particularly between 2016 and 2020, which I won't name any names, but I suspect your readers can figure out what was going on then. There were times where this world was profoundly demoralizing and things going on that were, you know, that I was depressed by, and it was much nicer to go into hell. And partly there were a couple of things. One is, as a writer, when I was creating this world, I controlled it, and things were happening out here in our country and in the world. I had no control over it. I was, you know, I'm sure your listeners feel this way too sometimes, that they're, you know, you're just like one little drop in 300 million people. And, but when I went into writing, I could make things happen. I could control things. And it's set in hell, but my characters are wonderful. They are people with flaws, people who made mistakes, people who are confused, but they're trying hard. They're connecting with each other. They're slowly becoming better people and learning about each other. And so there was this very, very horrific setting. And there is one very horrific scene in there that some readers have just like put the book down at that point. And I, you know, I wish I could tell them, look, just skip those 4 pages and keep going. It gets better. But the characters were uplifting. And so it was not depressing in that way.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what I did find depressing was, about a year before the book was going to come out, I decided I needed to do some marketing because everybody needs to market their books. And I started an Instagram account about images of hell from classic art, which started out being a lot of fun because I don't know a lot about art. I was exploring, I was learning stuff. And there's a huge amount of art in European tradition, which for many years, art was Christian art in the Middle Ages. And then up until the Renaissance, that was basically, you were painting religious art if you were doing any kind of art. So huge numbers of depictions of hell, depictions of, people being tormented in hell. And at first it was really interesting. And then after a while, that did get profoundly depressing because it was the same torment over and over and over again, and just painting after painting, or fresco after fresco, or sculpture after sculpture of people suffering in these terrible ways was really depressing. And, thinking about the artists who did this, who would spend months or years on a work just showing people being tormented, what that would do to you.
Yeah.
You wake up in the morning, you go to the church where you're working on this magnificent painting that takes up a whole wall of people being stabbed and garroted and burned to death, and you paint it all day, and you go home, and what that would be really depressing.
It would be really depressing. I've talked about this before with Christians who called into the show, and they say, well, why do you focus on hell? What about all these other great things about, Christianity and this other stuff? It's like, yeah, okay, we can talk about some of that stuff, but like, hey, the rest of my eternity, that's kind of a big deal, right? Like, I kind of want to know what's up with that. I kind of want to know what's going on there. And it doesn't seem like it's good. Doesn't seem like, I don't know, there's a nice way for me to go. At best, it's a separation, right? Whatever that means. Very vague. I maybe you have more insight into the specifics, because I've never found a good, understanding of what that really means. And at worst, it's the worst possible thing I could imagine. Which, yeah, that has to affect somebody somehow in some way. Maybe some people, they don't really think about it, but for me, at least, it was kind of a threat there. I will ask you this: is there a favorite version of hell that you've come to find? Is there one that you like better than others?
Well, of the visual depictions, I love Hieronymus Bosch, and his paintings are some of the most famous because they're just so bizarre. They're really like something from a, hallucinatory drug experience. And at one point, we were in Spain, and I got to see the original of it in the Prado Museum, which was amazing. There's so much detail in it that just looking at a little reproduction on your computer, you cannot get. There is so much detail in those. So visually, he's fantastic. He is like as creative with hell as J.R.R. Tolkien was with Middle Earth, maybe even more. But in terms of versions of hell, the one that was the most influential for me was Milton. And people, when I would say that I was writing a novel about hell, people would say, "Oh, you like the Inferno, Dante's Inferno," because that's really one of the most famous literary depictions of hell. And so one of the first things I did when I was working on this was I got a group of friends together to read the Inferno together, because I'd never read it. Not in Italian, we read it in English. And it's long enough and it's challenging enough that I wanted help. I needed friends. And it's a remarkable book for a number of reasons. And one is that he was writing in Italian, not in Latin. And he was one of the first people to do that. And he integrated classical mythology into this very Christian document in a way that was part of the Renaissance that, during the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have wanted to have the poet Virgil as your guide through hell because he was a pagan. But he really did that. And it's fascinating how he also used it as a contemporary political document. And he tried to get revenge on his political enemies. He was very involved in the politics of Florence, and there were two sides, and he was on the losing side, and he got exiled. But so he takes the people his enemies, and he puts them in different places in hell. This is the level for traitors, and this is the level for hypocrites. And it would be like if you were writing, if a liberal were writing a book about hell and he was putting Donald Trump there, or if a conservative was writing a book about hell and he put Joe Biden there.
Always the people you like the least, right?
Yeah,
Those are the bottom. Of course, of course.
So you can read it that way. And it was very, his structure was he had a very structured mind, and so he had all these different levels where each level, the punishment corresponded to the kind of sin. But what it wasn't was psychological, or you didn't get, it was not about people. It was about ideas.
Yeah.
And Milton, who was writing several hundred years later, Paradise Lost is his retelling of the story of the fall from the Garden of Eden. And as part of that, he's explaining, where Satan came from and what Satan was trying to do. And he describes this rebellion by angels led by Satan, Lucifer. They lost. They were exiled down to hell. God created this underworld for them with fire where they'd be exiled. And then Satan rallies the troops and goes forth to get revenge on God by tempting Adam and Eve. And what Milton did was he gave Satan a personality. He gave him an Adam and Eve personality also. It's more like reading a novel today where you understand their motivations and you can sort of see how they're thinking. And Satan is actually a really attractive character. And Milton did not intend to make him that way. Milton was a Puritan, but his religious beliefs, and I think his writerly, attraction to emotion and drama were at war with each other. And his Satan he's an underdog. He's charismatic. You have this scene where the devils are all floundering in the sea of fire, and they don't know what to do, and they're all giving up. And he rallies the troops, and he takes on, the little guy going against the big guy. And so to me, that was a much better story.
Yeah, I can see that.
And a compelling character. And that is kind of Satan. I mean, that's the backstory for my hell.
Okay, yeah.
If you took Satan and you moved whatever's happened 400 years instead of the 1600s, we're now in the 2000s. I pick it up from there.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a character that's the too goody two shoes, okay, right? That's not as interesting, right? When you have a character like Satan, who, I mean, come on, how many modern depictions have made Satan? Oh, wait, what if he was actually kind of the good guy, right? Giving knowledge to people and stuff. And you point out something too that's, I think, interesting from a lot of art from that period, that every single painting or statue I have seen of Satan from like the medieval times, it's always like the hottest guy you've ever seen. Like first, it's always a really attractive guy. And I guess the idea is supposed to be, well, lust or whatever, there's an element of that, but also like, hey, evil can be very attractive to people. I don't know. Or maybe they just want to make good looking men. I don't know what the thought process was there, but that is a funny thought to think about. And Satan is a character in your book, or is it a Satan-like character, or is it like
Satan is in the book?
Okay.
But in the book, what's happened is Satan is existentially depressed. He's realized that nothing he can do matters.
Right.
If he tortures humans, he's fulfilling God's will to punish them. If he doesn't torture them, he's being merciful. And that's, a Christian virtue, and he doesn't want to do that. So he can't torture, he can't not torture. Whatever he's doing God's will. And so he's decided to do nothing, and he's just lying on a gold bench in his big empty palace.
Yeah.
In a state of, lethargy.
Yeah, that makes sense, because in a Christian understanding of the figure of Satan, right? If you believe Revelation to be a literal accounting of future events, there is an idea that Satan actually, is terminated, right? Is thrown in that lake of fire. And so there's sort of a predestination for Satan. So that's kind of one interesting angle to explore. Is like, okay, well, if it's all for naught anyway, what's the deal? I don't know why you even try. So yeah, I can see how it can be an interesting idea to exploit that sort of existential angst that may come with well, being Satan, I guess. Also, doing the work of God. That's an interesting idea for part of that too, right? Because if God wants you, if he's setting it up for you, then yeah, you are kind of doing the work of God there, which is quite interesting. I see that we have some callers that were trying to call in, and it looks like we may be having some issues there. If you're calling into the show, just keep trying, and we'll try to connect you in there. But for now, I'm just going to keep talking with Ilana, because I'm having a great conversation here on the topic of your book and a sort of message. You actually made a note to me that it's really annoying when people ask writers about the message of the novel, but you said I could ask it anyway. So I am going to ask you, what do you think is the message of your book overall, if you could give it one?
So, yeah, writers hate being asked that, because if you can boil it down to one sentence, why did you spend 300 pages writing it? And what about the experience of reading through it? But if I could boil it down to a message, I think it is that hope and salvation, not in the religious terms, but in our own personal struggles, lies in connecting with other people. And my characters, who are flawed, who are confused, eventually improve their situation. I won't say how the book ends, but what's really key is making connections across these barriers of time, place, religion, culture. And so I think that is where I see our hope, our quote unquote salvation. I also wrote a sequel, which will be coming out next winter. And in the dedication to the sequel, I said, it says, "To my parents who placed their faith in people, including their 3 children."
I like that. That's really nice. I think too, talking about that subject actually is a good segue for another question I have for you here, which is like, for folks who don't even, you never grew up religious, never engaged with Christianity, never had these, kinds of fears of hell or anything like that. Is there a reason to engage in this book? Is there a reason to engage in this sort of narrative that you've given out? Because like you said, for some people, it might even be traumatic to kind of think about a scenario that you're given, even if you know in your head it's fictional. That doesn't take away, of course, from the experiences that many of us had, particularly growing up, like if that think that that's real. So what would you say to folks who are maybe on the fence who have an idea like that?
So I think, first of all, there's a lot of humor in the book. There are funny parts. There are inspiring parts. There's a very good sex scene. And so it's a good read, and it's an easy read. But it's a smooth read that does raise these questions about how can a supposedly just God create or tolerate such an unjust universe. So it's I've had a lot of really nice visits with book groups who've found a lot to talk about from the book. I mean, like we are today, but talking about issues of justice, of God, of how they were raised with or without religion. And I think the whole issue of hell, if you're someone who doesn't believe, but you end up talking to believers a lot, or maybe you're questioning your own, whether, you're trying to figure out your own beliefs. I think it's a real sort of entry point for challenging religion, the concept of hell, more than heaven, in fact, because everyone wants to believe in heaven. You have a self-interest in it. We all want to think of ourselves as good people. We all want to assume that we're going somewhere wonderful. We don't want to die. We hope that there's something. There's a lot of incentive to want to believe in heaven. With hell, it's, if you think about it, there's less incentive to want to believe in it. If you feel like you may be condemned there for making the slightest mistake, or if your best friend from elementary school who was Muslim or Jewish or agnostic or Hindu, if they're going to end up in hell because of not choosing the right religion, I think that's a real place where you can start to challenge or think critically about the whole tenet.
Mm. Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And like with your own perspective, right? I imagine you had to have, I mean, maybe, I don't know if you were, fully atheist before writing this thing, and maybe you're even more atheist now after writing. Have your own views about religion or the afterlife or anything have changed after researching and writing this book?
They actually did a little bit. I mean, I went into it pretty committed atheist. I came out a committed atheist, so that didn't change. But my understanding of why people would want to believe in hell changed. And I went in thinking, this is just an oppressive concept. It's something that people in power use to control people who don't have power, whether it's the Pope or it's the king. But, you threaten people with eternal pain and punishment if they don't do what you want them to do. That's basically, it's a coercive concept. But as I thought about, and so I just saw it as completely negative. But as I thought about it and spent more time there, I thought of so many people in history who have suffered, who have miserable lives, who are suffering from other people doing really bad, evil things to them, and looking for something to keep them going and looking for justice. And I think the idea of justice, I mean, there are social scientists who know a lot more about this than I do. And the question of whether is there a concept of justice that is hardwired into us, the way, it's hardwired to want to have sex or things like, is there a human desire for justice or a human concept for justice that exists across cultures? And I think without any social science background, I think there is, and people yearn for justice. And if they don't see it around themselves, they look for it in mythology or religion. And so the idea of having a punishing place that will punish people who have done really bad things, who are not being punished in life, is, in a way, I wouldn't say it's beautiful, but I could understand it. And sure. It wasn't just the do these things that I tell you to do or you're going to burn forever, but it was a beautiful human yearning.
I think so. That's interesting that you call it beautiful, because the beauty is not the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about it, really. I mean, like, I don't have a punitive understanding of justice anymore. I really think that was part of my Christian upbringing that kind of instilled that in me. And I think as someone who kind of has a more rehabilitative understanding of justice, hell is kind of antithetical to that in many ways.
Absolutely. There's no in the classic hell, and in the one that I described in the book, there's no mercy. And that's my main character at one point says that what kind of world is this, where there's punishment, but if you change, if you grow, if you repent, if you want to do better, there is no opportunity for that. And I agree. So I don't think hell is beautiful, but I think the yearning for justice is beautiful. And to the extent that, I can see hell in the light of this yearning for justice, it made a little more sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best thing you could say about the concept of hell, right? So I got to give you props there, right? If we think about it as, I think you're right, maybe as a concept of how can we make sure that people get their just desserts? How can we make sure that there's something for us to at least rest on at the end of the day? I can see how hell can fulfill that role. I don't think it does it super well, and you probably don't either. I imagine you don't. Yeah. But there is something to be said about that. There is something about the human expression of justice. Hell is an emblematic of that, and not just, of course, the Christian understanding of hell. There's also other religious interpretations of hell. There's a lot of people are surprised to know that there is a Hindu and Buddhist concept of hell that's not always universal, right? But that certain sects have, and of course, lots of world faiths kind of have some idea of a justice that can pretty much only happen in the afterlife, because the world we live in is as cruel as it is, right? Folks at home who've been watching, thanks so much. While we've been dealing with some stuff, if you try to call into the show now, we should be able to talk to you. And I see we got some folks that are on the line. So we're going to take some calls now, a little bit later in the show than I like, but hey, we're going to do it anyway. Ilana, you want to talk to some people?
Absolutely. I'd love to.
All right, let's get to it then. Before we get started, though, you guys know I always have to thank the patron of the week, because every single week I'm always giving you guys a shout out to the folks that donate on that Patreon. So thank you guys so much for donating. This week's patron of the week is going to be Stefan von den Berg. Thank you so much, Stefan, or Steven. I don't know. They never give me pronunciation guides for these things. You guys should leave like little pronunciation guides on your name on Patreon. I wish Patreon had that feature, but it kind of doesn't. But regardless, thank you so much for donating. Thank you to everybody that donates. You guys rock. And Kelly Laughlin, by the way, being cheeky here, gifting 5 Truth Wanted memberships. Kelly always donating here. Kelly, you can't be donating. You're backup host here. Come on now. But thanks for donating, Kelly. We'll give you that shout out anyway. Let's go ahead and talk to some of you guys now. We have Dan, who is calling in from Canada. Dan from Canada, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's going on?
Hey, Dan, Ilana. I'm doing well. Just got back home after a long time out, and I saw the chat question talking about hell, and that got me thinking about demon possession. And I thought, hey, I'll give ObjectivelyDan a call.
Yeah, it sounds like a good time. Demon possession. We all love demon possessions here. So what about demon possession specifically did you want to talk about?
There was this BBC story I came across a couple of years ago, and I looked it up. It's still up there. Police captain confirms children possessed by demons.
Yep, checks out. I have no question. I have no further questions on that story. That seems legit to me. No, nothing to argue about there. But yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, yeah. Looking into the story, there was a lot of claims, a lot of weirdness, but somehow even in 2014 there was a cell phone video or just some stated reports of children walking up walls and other typical movie possession stuff. But I just
You just thought that was a weird story that you wanted to share, or you just want to get my take?
Yeah, kind of both. And I know you were having some technical difficulties, so I figure I'd give you guys a call with something.
No, yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, folks, again, we have open lines, so please go ahead and call in, and we should be able to talk with you guys. But yeah, so I mean, the thing with these possession stories, it's very funny because the Catholic Church is going to be the first group of people to tell you, oh yeah, like possession's still totally a thing, right? I used to think, well, maybe, a lot of Christians feel differently about this. When I was a Christian and you hear stories about this, it was always like, okay, well, that kind of happened a long time ago, but I don't know if that stuff happens today. But then you talk to the Catholics and they're like, oh yeah, that stuff's happening like all the time. What do you mean? Like they do conferences every year training people on how to exorcise people from these possessions. So I think if you grow up with that understanding, right, like you're going to start to attribute things to that belief being real, right? It's in the same way that I don't think like skinwalkers are real, right? If I grew up in a tradition group or a group that has a tradition of skinwalkers, I'm going to start seeing skinwalkers. I really think that's how it happens with these kinds of things. Same thing with the possession stuff. Unfortunately, possession, of course, quite infamously, being used to the detriment of the mentally ill, right? Folks who do struggle with mental illness seem to have these signs of demon possession, right? Oh, crazy how that turns out. But yeah, it's often been used as a point of discrimination for those who do it. And maybe that's the case here as well. Maybe there's something else going on. I don't know. At the end of the day, though, we are living in 2024, as you mentioned. It is kind of hard for me to believe when people say, oh yeah, this is totally happening. But yeah, I don't know, if somebody acting weird on camera Wouldn't be the first time that's happened. Probably not the last. I wouldn't jump to the demon stuff, but I don't know. Ilana, I'll bring this over to you. Demons. You got demons in your book as well? Maybe.
I just have devils in hell. I don't. I am. Demon possession will have to be a completely different book.
Gotcha.
Maybe I'll call it The Exorcist.
Yeah, that seems like a winner to me. But yeah, was demon possession or any kind of demonic influence, was that a source of your interest when you were researching and writing it?
I did not get into that. No.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Dan, I don't know. I think I gave my take. I don't know if Ilana has any more words than that, but anything else you want to hear from us?
Yeah, I just with your poll question up there, I was definitely taught as a child I was hellbound. Yeah, that did lots of good.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah,
the idea of demons and stuff, yeah.
Was that something that was traumatic for you as a child? Were you like scared of going to hell, or were you confident that you wouldn't? And what made you move away from that?
Oh no, I assumed I was screwed. Yeah, I just it just always seemed like, nope, definitely not going to make the cut. That was a huge fear of mine growing up. I think the thing that finally moved me away from it has been talking with atheists and getting a better approach to things, because like I'd still say I have moments where it's like, I fear I'm going to hell. It might all be real and I screwed up. So yeah, it's a long lasting thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely probably one of the worst aspects of my Christian upbringing, and I probably imagine a lot for other people. Besides, like, of course, the absolutely real institutional abuses that can occur in people's lives, and sometimes not even just abuses. Sometimes just the reality of saying, hey, this thing I believed turns out just isn't true, right? That can be a traumatic experience of it in and of itself. And that's not even including when you bring in the supernatural, when you bring in, ideas of being possessed or hell being a real threat to you. It's hard for me to take seriously now, but when I was a Christian, it was very real, and it was very hard for me to get over that part of it. So I'm glad, Dan, that you can call this show and talk about your experiences with it, because I imagine there's a lot of viewers that probably still work through that. And if you do work through that, and if you're still working through it, please come in and call the show if you still have fears about it. We've talked to people who are still going through that as well. I would love to hear about your experiences, and I would love to help tell you that things are going to be okay and why you can kind of put some of those thoughts to rest. But anyways, Dan, thanks so much for sharing. Anything else that you want to add?
Not really. Keep up the good work. Love the show.
Thanks so much, Dan. That's awesome. And thanks for sharing that story as well. Yeah, we'll go ahead and let you go, but have a great rest of your night. Wow. Yeah. Demon possessions, huh? Yeah, still happening, I guess. Again, still gonna happen for a long time. I don't know. Any thoughts on that call, Lana?
When I've talked to book groups, one of the things I've asked them is about how they grew up and if they grew up with hell. And one of the saddest stories, I've heard stories like Dan's, where they grew up worried that they were screwed. And I think it's a terrible thing to put on children.
Yeah.
There is so much as a child that's scary, period, without even thinking about this. It can be scary to be alone in your room at night. It can be scary if mom and dad are fighting. It can be scary if your home is flooded and you lose your home. It can be scary if there's a mean dog. There's like so much that's frightening. And to put on top of that the idea that you might go to this place after you die and be punished forever painfully is just horrible.
Yeah.
One of the women I talked to in one of these groups was not Christian. She was the daughter of two scientists who didn't believe in, they didn't raise her with any religion. But she had a friend who was Catholic, and she would go have sleepovers at her friend's house or spend time with her and go to church with her sometimes. And started hearing these hell sermons and became convinced that she and her parents were all doomed because they weren't Catholics, and would go home and she would pray silently by herself in her room that her parents and she wouldn't have to go to hell. I mean, that's horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's nothing good about it. There's nothing good about it. I mean, what more is there to say, honestly, right? Yeah, I wish if there, I don't want to eradicate people's beliefs. I think I would want to be like UNESCO. I would want to have, cultural sites for people's beliefs. I think, like, there's some stuff that I definitely want to go away for sure, but there is something about the human condition and human psychology that would fascinate me to, just to look at. That's one of those beliefs, though, where it's like, maybe it is good that one would just go away, right? Maybe that's one where it doesn't really have a whole lot of benefit, and we can work on better ideas for people. But I don't know. We have some other callers, though, I want to talk to. Before we do that, though, it is the top of the hour here. So I got to get some announcements out of the way real quick. One is that you've been hearing a lot about our annual Bat Cruise fundraiser. It's happening next week. Next Truth Wanted, we're going to be having an awesome in-person show with a whole bunch of faces. So check that out when it happens. But if you're going to the Bat Cruise, you're going to be seeing Christy Powell, Lacrosse Examiner, Jimmy Jr., Kelly Laughlin, Secular Rarity, J Mike, and of course, Forrest Valkai, all going to be there and more. So if you haven't got your tickets, unfortunately, you're going to have to be on a wait list. But maybe if you get on that wait list, you might be able to still get on the boat. So come join us if you're going to be in the Austin area. Bat Cruise is going to be a super awesome event. Also, if you want to hear our content in audio only form, you can go to tiny.cc/AEN podcasts for all of the latest ACA shows. You don't have to watch my face if you don't like it. So go listen to the show if you like that. But if you ever said to yourself, hey, I really like this stuff and I just want to listen to it all the time, every day, 24/7. Well, guess what? We have not one, but two different 24/7 live streams. One of them for the Atheist Experience, the other one for Talk Heathen, that you can listen to for both. You can go to tiny.cc/AXPTV or tiny.cc/HeathenTV to join in on the fun. And let me tell you, there's always somebody in those chats that you can talk to. So if you just want to talk to somebody about some of these ideas that are being talked about and you don't have anywhere else to go, that's a great place to do it. Last but not least, before we move on, I have to thank the wonderful, fantastic, amazing crew that help make this show happen every single week. Switching that crew cam, and of course the dogs that also help make this show happen. That's also great. Thank you to the crew, and thanks to everybody watching for this show, because it's really made for you and by your support. So thanks so much for that. Now, let's go ahead and keep going to our next caller here. We have another Canadian trying to talk to us tonight. We have Heath from Canada. Heath, you're live on Truth Wanted. What's going on?
Hi there. Just kind of, since you brought up the subject of hell, I kind of wanted to tell you as an atheist, kind of like, it's something that happened to me on my first day at school. And this was like before actual school. It was like summer school. I was 4 years old. And so this is like, except for a few concerts my parents took me to, my first experience was being with a bunch of other kids other than my family. And the first kid I talked to was this other 4-year-old little girl. And she came up to me, and the first thing she said to me and my brother were, God is always watching us, you know? And we were like, oh, well, God's not real. There's no such thing. And then she wandered off, and a couple of minutes later, her mom came up to us and started screaming at us. And I remember distinctly what she said. She said, you've got a black heart and you're going to hell. And to a 4-year-old kid, you know? And I remember my exact thought at the time, because I have a kind of reactionary memory. I remember my reactions to things, and then the rest comes. And my reaction was, oh, this poor kid. Like, what a terrible parent. Like, I felt so bad for that kid. I didn't feel like I had a black heart and was going to hell. I knew I didn't have a black heart because we only watched documentaries in my house. We watched no commercial television, just PBS.
That's right. Like
I
the
watched
good
a
Lord
lot of science
intended.
documentaries. I knew my heart was.
Of course. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. And I didn't believe in hell. So my reaction was, oh, this poor kid. What a terrible parent. And it's just kind of a thought for people who think that they get their morality from Christianity. And I remember when I was a little older, 7 years old or 8 years old, I wanted to join Boy Scouts because my entire social group would go on Wednesday nights to Boy Scouts. And so I saved up my allowance for, I think, 2 months in order to be able to buy the little scarf and the shirts so that I could go. And on my first day, we went and did the stuff. My dad was a boat builder, so the knot tying and stuff I already knew. I kind of got to be a hero there. But at the end of the day, he was like, okay, now we're all going to pray to God. And I was like, for reasons, I had already gone through whether or not I believed in God, and I didn't. And I was like, well, no, that's dishonest. That's lying. So I'm not going to do it. And they kicked me out at that point. It was like one day of Boy Scouts, I have to save up for 2 months to buy the stuff. And they wouldn't let me back in because I refused to. What I thought of at the time was lying.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize this, but as an Eagle Scout myself, I can tell you. And first of all, by the way, it's handkerchiefs. It is not scarves. You'll get roasted by Boy Scouts, but being roasted by a Boy Scout isn't that big of a deal. But yeah, Boy Scouts of America is a Christian organization started by a very Christian man, Lord Baden-Powell, and the United States definitely took on a Christian identity. There are several religious specific awards you can get within the Boy Scouts. So when a lot of people hear that, I guess they get surprised because I don't know, most people see it as pretty secular, but no, it's an explicitly Christian org for sure. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me that they might take offense to your lack of belief there.
I'm just really glad that at the age of 4.
Go ahead, Ilana.
I'm just really glad that at the age of 4 you had the confidence and the sense of self that you were able to not take that woman's comment to heart, and that you also had the empathy to feel for her daughter. That's a testament to that your parents were doing something right with you.
I agree.
Oh, well, thank you. And I think it would just be a testament to you don't need religion to get moral as well. Like, I remember the Boy Scout leader saying to me, well, just pretend to pray. You can just pretend. And I was like, that's a lie. I'm not going to be dishonest. Because I'd gone through this thing where something had come up in the news. My mother had said, something had come up about religion. And I remember saying to my mom, well, that wouldn't happen to our family. We're all atheists. And she said, well, your dad isn't. And I was like, what? It's like, well, no, he was raised as a Christian and he still kind of believes. I mean, we don't push it on you guys, but he's a theist. We didn't use the phrase theist back then. And I thought, well, that's 5 against 1. That's not very cool. I'm going to become a theist. And I tried for 2 weeks. I tried really, really hard to believe in God. And I just couldn't do it because I don't believe in magic. And that was a benchmark for me. You have to believe in magic first, and you hear a story about something that's true that happens, and you hear a fairy tale, and they have a very different structure. And to me, everything I heard from the Bible was the fairy tale structure. You don't believe that stuff. It's got a very obvious, made upness to it. So I guess my final question for you guys is that about a year ago, I was listening to a podcast about science and technology and about what it would take to get humans out into the galaxy. And I realized what would actually convince me that God was real. And my first reaction to that was, wow, I'm being completely unreasonable, or am I? And so I want to get your opinion. I thought if every time we looked at a new sun, there was a habitable planet around it, perfect for humans, that is so unlikely that would probably convince me that God existed. But that's already not the case. And when I saw it, was like, am I being an unreasonable prick? I mean, is this a rational, you know? So what do you guys think about that?
Let me try to understand your hypothetical. You're saying if it were true that every time we looked at a new star outside of our solar system and we found a habitable planet, not necessarily a lived on planet, but a habitable planet, that would increase your likelihood in the existence of God being real. Is that right?
Yeah, because even a super powerful alien race, because of the constraints of the speed of light and how much energy it would take, it's kind of unreasonable to think that could be done by anything other than basically magic. You know?
Yeah. I could see that. I could see that.
I think that would, yeah.
But at that point, wouldn't the aliens be a more reasonable explanation? Because at least there's some naturalism going on there, right? Like if we exist, I still don't understand under naturalism why there couldn't be other life forms doing stuff, right?
Yeah, aliens are pretty unlikely because you would see a kind of wave of them moving through the universe. You would still see planets they hadn't yet reached and stuff like that.
Maybe.
And if the aliens were able to just go to every point in the universe at once and create a habitable planet that's perfect for us, at that point, I'm willing to say that God's at least equally likely.
Maybe,
you know,
but that is literally the plot of Neon Genesis Evangelion. So I don't know. That could be a possibility. I don't know. This is a big hypothetical. I think like the fact that we don't see that, right, is maybe more of a testament to that, you know, God not being a thing. Maybe if that was the case, I would say to be reasonable, I think it could perhaps increase the likelihood of a creator that creates the universe that is like, you know, maybe is interested in life being formed. Sure, maybe it increases the likelihood. But when it comes to the whole God part, right, because God is a very specific word with very specific connotations for a lot of people, I don't think it increases the Christian God in the slightest, for sure, or the Jewish God, or, you know, any of the Abrahamic understandings of God. I think it would have to be a kind of different God in general. The Christian God is particularly interested in the Jewish people, for one, and then, you know, eventually Christianity, and then I guess Muslims too, eventually then. You know, so other beings on other planets, that wasn't really in the realm of at least humans' understanding of what God wanted. So it had to be either a very different understanding of what the Christian God is, or just a different kind of God altogether. So I don't know. I guess that's the best answer I can come up with for your hypothetical there. But I want to hear Ilana's take.
Well, what I'm hearing is that the caller, I'm sorry, I forget your name, is trying to come up with a scenario that is, in his mind, inexplicable by science. And, you know, different people with different understandings of science could come up with something like similar. I mean, you could say, oh my God, if I got a pizza that just came out of the oven with symmetrical little pieces of cheese that all looked like Jesus, that might prove that God, that proves to me that God exists. And, well, you know, we would find a lot of rational reasons for that. The baker did it, whatever. But I think probably we all have some threshold where if there was something really miraculous that couldn't be explained otherwise, then you do turn to God or you turn to a religious explanation. But as Dan said, that's not the universe that we're living in. We don't have habitable planets in every
That's kind of my
system.
point. So am I being unreasonable? Because this is already not the case. We already know that this isn't a thing, you know? So when I say this is my criteria, it's like, my criteria would be if 2 + 2 equaled 3, right? You know,
Yeah,
it's
I hear what
something
you're
which we
saying.
know isn't real. So am I
get what
being
you're trying to say. I don't think I was getting it before, but I'm getting what you're saying now. You're saying, is it unreasonable for this to be my drawing line, right? For like whether God can be real. And I would say, I think I could come up with some better ideas for reasonable, reasonable beliefs. No, I would say reasonable reasons, I guess, why a God could be real. I think you can come up with some better ones. I'll give you some examples right now. If there was a God who very clearly gave his intent and did it through a press conference so that like multiple people, verified journalists, for example, could like do interviews with and collect statements from, and we could like look at different news sources and see, oh yeah, this person definitely said this thing because this source got this source got. I mean, I don't think that's that unreasonable. A lot of people will scoff at that and say, well, God can't do that. And I say, well, why not? Seems like it works for everybody else on earth. I don't know why, Jesus couldn't come out and give like a press statement or something. I think that would make things more clear. I think if a God came out and just talked to people, just made his intent clear. For some Christians, that's too unreasonable, but I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that if I'm a creator of a people and I want them to worship me and have this great relationship with me, I think you got to talk to him every once in a while, right? So I don't know. That would be my sort of line to draw. If God could just do that, that'd be great. But anything beyond that, I'm going to be skeptical a little bit. But I don't know, Ilana, what do you think?
There's a long history of using miracles to prove that somebody is God. It goes back to Exodus when Moses is talking to Pharaoh and he does all these things. He, turns the rod into snakes and things like that. And Pharaoh's magicians copy part of it. And so I think we all kind of look to that, but there's so far nothing that has really been definitive.
Yeah. But if you were posed with the question, right? If somebody's asking, what would it take for you to believe in God? What would you answer to that?
I would need to see some kind of miracle that was completely inexplicable, and that was not inexplicable because we didn't understand the science of it yet. I mean, there are things that are inexplicable with quantum physics and with the way the universe works that are still being researched. So just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's God. But if it were something, if somebody came back from the dead and they were really truly that person and they were standing there talking to me, that would be that would shake the way I thought.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it would shake the way I would think too. Yeah. So I don't know. That's the thing, Heath, because like when you're talking to somebody who thinks you're the one being unreasonable, I would just say, hey, look at these stories that say that would happen. Why can't they happen to me? Right. I just think that that's a reasonable way to look at it. I have not had a miracle happen to me. I've heard stories of miracles, but that's about it. So maybe a miracle would change the needle, but overall, it's got to be something more than just, well, it's because the book says so, right? Which is what I think a lot of people rely on. But Heath, what do you think?
I couldn't think of a miracle that wouldn't convince me. You make me think of The Prestige, like the book where someone actually does come back from the dead, and it turns out that it's actually his twin brother, and his other brother was killed, but they have been living as the same person for so long that they've lost all sense of their own identity. And they just both live as the same person because they've been doing it every day for decades, and they've just lost any individuality, right? And that would be a rational way of explaining someone coming back. That could fool people, right?
Yeah.
That would fool me in that scenario. So knowing that this is possible, I don't even think someone coming back from the dead would be convincing enough for me.
Okay.
It's something I haven't explained yet. Like I've had times when I feel like a dream I've had is coming true, and my reaction to that is, oh, that chemical in the brain that squirts when you remember something is squirting at the wrong time now. I don't think that I can see the future or dream the future. I just know that my brain is misquoting the chemical and making me believe that. Like, there's probably very little that would make me lean towards magic rather than a rational explanation, if you know what I mean.
I think so too. I think that's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because when it comes to miracles, right, at least ones that we personally experience, that's also going to be to your own detriment, because unless you have other people in on that experience, the thing is, people have suffered from delusions. It happens every day. It happens all the time, even in younger, healthier people, right? Like, it can still happen. So somebody just saying, hey, this thing happened to me, that's still not going to be enough, at least for me, right? I think it has to be something that could at least be somewhat verified through some other process than just, well, I saw it happen, right? Like, people say, well, why does it have to be, well, why do you have to use all these methods? Why does it have to go through science or whatever? And it doesn't even have to be like an article written about it or anything. I'm just talking about like something beyond just a fishtail, right? Which is what a lot of miracles end up being to me, at least, right? Like, oh yeah, that was this big, I don't know. But I think you're right on the money there. If anybody's challenging you about this kind of stuff, I would just say, look, there's lots of ways it could happen, right? There's a whole book of stuff that I think could happen, but doesn't happen to me. And I would just point to that. But Heath, I do want to plug something real quick, since the crew brought it up. For those who've been listening to the show and maybe have been struggling with their own beliefs, particularly with hell beliefs, we do often partner with an organization called Recovering from Religion, that has some great resources on their website, and also has some folks that you can talk to on the phone about what you're going through. So just a quick plug for folks who want to have some of those resources. But for now, Heath, I am going to go ahead and let you go. Any last words you wanted to shout out before you sign off today?
I would like to plug the Philip K. Dick book, Maze of Death, which is a book where people figure out the frequency to broadcast on to actually have their prayers answered. And it's just a fascinating book about what if you could like pray into a radio and actually get them answered. And it's Philip K. Dick, so you can't go wrong. So Maze of Death, check it out.
Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
I hear that guy writes some good stories. Here he's got a few bangers, that Philip K. Dick. But anyway, Heath, appreciate your call. Thanks so much. And gosh, we have some other folks I see in the queue here, but we're getting towards the end of the show. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to the after show in just a bit here, which is at the Atheist Community of Austin fan-run Discord server. So a link to that is going to be in the description. It's also there on screen there, tiny.cc/ACD Discord. So bring your calls, bring your questions to the Discord. We'll break for just a few minutes after the show, and then we're going to go into that after show for you guys if you want to talk to us live, but not on the air. That's one of the cool things is if you don't like being recorded and you don't want your conversation all out there, it's a non-recorded space for us to hang out. We'll be going there in just a second. But before we do, I need to thank our wonderful guest tonight, Ilana DeBare, for being on the show and giving us her fascinating perspective and also interesting stories about the research and writing on her book, and of course talking about her book itself. Ilana, thanks so much for being on the air with us.
Thank you. It's been great. And if people want to get the book, it's on Amazon. The title is Shaken Loose, and it's my name, Ilana DeBare, but Shaken Loose on Amazon.
Yeah, awesome. And of course, want to give you a chance to plug if you have any social media websites, stuff where people should go find you if they want to see more of your stuff.
Yeah, my website is ilanadebare.com, ILANADEBARE, like in my picture right below me, all one word, .com. And I don't know, do you have a meme of the book? Or
I think we have a picture. I think Cruz should be putting it up in just a second.
Because I have an actual copy if people want it, but if you're going to be...
There it is.
It's got the fire. But if you actually have a meme, that's even better.
Yeah, I think so. Crew, let me know if we have that. Oh, they don't have it ready for us right now at the moment. But
okay.
but hey, we got the book on the screen there, so you can see exactly what it looks like. It does look like a book about hell, to be fair. You know, it's kind of got that good color scheme. So good choice on your publisher's part on that. But yeah, Ilana, thanks so much for joining us today. And folks at home, thanks again for putting up with this again today with some of our technical difficulties. Thanks so much for watching. I want to remind you guys about the segment this week. The prompt is complete the sentence. It's a bad idea to blank at a formal event. And I look forward to reading your comments for next week, where we're going to be doing our special in-studio show. I also want to give a quick shout out to Kelly for being our backup host tonight. Thanks so much, Kelly, for hanging in there. He's going to be in the after show as well, if you want to talk to him. And we're going to be going there now. So without further ado, folks, I'm going to go ahead and sign off on tonight's program. I'm Objectively Dan. Remember to always keep on the truth, and I'll see you next time.
Watch the non-profits and join the hosts in the live chat. Visit tiny.cc/ytnp.